In the summer of 1767, in Braintree, Massachusetts, the cry of a newborn echoed inside a small wooden house facing the wind from the Atlantic. The scent of salt and the sway of tall grass filled the warm air. The infant was named John Quincy Adams, born to John Adams, who would one day become the second president of the United States, and Abigail Adams, a woman of sharp intellect and remarkable strength, far beyond the expectations placed on women of her era. From the earliest days of his life, John Quincy understood, in the quiet way a child can understand, that his home was not like others. He grew up surrounded by conversations of liberty, justice, human rights, and the fragile dream of a nation not yet born. While other children chased each other through fields, John Quincy sat at the corner of a long oak table, listening as his parents and their friends debated the future of a land that existed more in thought than reality. The American Revolution erupted when he was only a boy. Whispers of battles, hurried letters delivered in the dark, and the sight of his father leaving home again and again were carved deeply into his memory. On some nights, Abigail would keep a candle burning in the window, small, flickering, steadfast, waiting for her husband to return. Young John Quincy stood beside her, not fully understanding the politics of war, but feeling the weight of longing and hope. Abigail herself became his first and most profound teacher. She taught him to read and write, yes, but more importantly, she taught him to think. She refused to let her son become merely the shadow of a great father. She urged him to discover truth on his own terms. While the world outside moved with chaos and musket fire, John Quincy sat by the window with a book, reading histories of ancient empires. Their rise, their brilliance, their inevitable collapse. From these pages, questions formed. What truly holds a nation together? He once asked. Abigail answered with quiet certainty. Wisdom, discipline, and truth. Without truth, even the strongest nation will fall. Those words would anchor him for life. In 1778, at only 11 years old, John Quincy embarked on a journey that would shape him forever. He crossed the Atlantic with his father, traveling to France, then the Netherlands, then England, into rooms lit by candlelight, where diplomats bargained futures with polite smiles and sharp intentions. The boy did not merely watch, he absorbed. He listened to the rhythms of foreign speech, learned new languages, studied the posture of persuasion, the silent negotiations hidden between glances. He recorded his experiences in a journal, writing, "I study not for distinction, but to become useful." This became his private vow. Yet his childhood was not gilded with privilege. The constant voyages meant long separations from his mother. He came to know loneliness intimately. Abigail's letters traveled across oceans, full of fire and steadiness. You were not born to a life of ease, but to a life of purpose, she reminded him. When he returned to America, John Quincy was no longer a child. His eyes seemed older, more watchful. He studied at Harvard and graduated at 20 years old, then turned to the law, not as a tool for power, but as a framework for justice. To him, the law was not merely a collection of rules. It was the architecture of dignity. His essays on international politics caught attention across the young nation. They reached the eyes of George Washington, who recognized not only talent, but clarity of vision. He saw that John Quincy possessed something rare, the ability to see America not just as it was, but as it could be. And so at just 26 years old, John Quincy Adams was appointed U.S. Minister to the Netherlands. On the day he boarded the ship, the sea stretched broad and bright under the rising sun. The wind tugged at his coat as he looked toward the horizon. He knew the journey ahead would be long and difficult. He would face foreign courts, political storms, betrayals, and nights of aching homesickness. He knew he would stand alone many times. But he did not shrink. For ever since he was a child, listening in the candlelit shadows of a revolutionary discussion, he understood something essential. His life did not belong merely to himself. It belonged to a larger idea, to the creation of a nation that believed in principle, honor, and the worth of every person. And with that first step onto the deck of the ship, his long road toward becoming the 6th President of the United States quietly began. The deck of the ship creaked beneath John Quincy Adams' feet as it cut across the gray-blue Atlantic swells. He was 26 years old, yet his face seemed older, shaped by storms that did not belong to youth. It was the winter of 1794, and the young republic he served was still fragile, its future uncertain. Europe was a continent in turmoil. Monarchies trembled before uprisings inspired by the same flames that had sparked America's struggle for independence. France, once America's ally, now convulsed in revolution and blood. Britain watched with wary eyes. Alliances shifted like sand in a storm. Into this world of unrest, John Quincy was sent as United States Minister to the Netherlands. It was not a position granted by family privilege, though his father, John Adams, was president at the time. It was earned through discipline, scholarship, and a mind sharpened in the fires of diplomacy before most men completed their schooling. Even George Washington, stoic, measured, cautious, had recognized something singular in the young man's writings and reports from Europe. Washington did not give praise lightly. This journey was not adventure. It was duty. The Netherlands, though small, was a crucial fulcrum of finance and trade. American credit, still new and unproven, had to be defended there. If confidence in the United States collapsed, the nation would find itself isolated, powerless in a world ruled by old empires. Adams's mission was to maintain trust, to present America as stable, rational, and worthy of political respect. He wrote in his diary, "A statesman must see clearly through the present, into the past, and toward the future." This belief carried him through long winters and long conversations in candlelit meeting rooms where ambassadors debated endlessly without ever speaking plainly. But the world would soon become far more complicated. In 1795, the French armies marched into the Netherlands, toppling the Dutch government and establishing the Batavian Republic. Ministers fled. Treaties dissolved. Negotiations shattered overnight. For the second time in his young life, John Quincy Adams found himself in the shadow of revolution. Not as a witness this time, but as a representative of a nation still learning its place in the world. There were moments when even he wondered whether the United States had sent him too soon, whether the burden placed upon him was too heavy. Letters from home arrived slowly, weeks, sometimes months late. His mother wrote with the familiar blend of warmth and firmness. "You must remember, my son, that the world is rarely gentle to those who wish to change it." He folded the letter carefully and carried it in his coat pocket. It became a companion in moments when the weight of responsibility pressed down hardest. Then came a moment that would define him. President George Washington appointed him U.S. Minister to Prussia. He was still only 30 years old. Berlin was a city of stern architecture, chilly boulevards, and disciplined ceremony. The Prussian court was deeply formal, its rules of etiquette more rigid than steel. Diplomats here were expected to be not merely intelligent, but flawlessly poised. One misplaced gesture could be interpreted as an insult. One misunderstanding could unravel years of negotiation. John Quincy, naturally reserved and thoughtful, adapted well. But adaptation did not make the work easy. Prussia was a kingdom of ambition, aware that Europe was shifting and that power hung in a delicate balance. Britain watched France. France challenged monarchies. Russia pressed westward. The United States was a young republic in a world of ancient empires, and many in Europe believed it would fail. Adams had to convince them otherwise. Through careful negotiation, quiet persistence, and eloquent argument, he secured trade agreements that helped stabilize America's fragile economy. He established relationships based on respect rather than fear, clarity rather than manipulation. His mind, sharpened by years of travel and study, became one of America's greatest diplomatic instruments. And yet, in the midst of diplomacy and politics, something unexpected happened. He fell in love. Her name was Louisa Catherine Johnson, the daughter of an American merchant living in London and a mother of English descent. Louisa spoke French effortlessly, understood music, poetry, and conversation in a way that made others feel seen. She was gentle, graceful, and perceptive, qualities John Quincy had always admired. Their courtship was quiet, thoughtful, and filled with letters, some hesitant, others full of unexpected tenderness. John Quincy, who rarely allowed emotion to alter his judgment, found himself struggling with feelings he could not categorize or analyze into reason. Love was not something to be debated. It arrived like weather. They married in London in 1797. At the wedding, candles flickered warmly, and for the first time in many years, John Quincy allowed himself a moment of happiness unburdened by politics, war, or duty. But marriage did not grant peace. Less than a year later, he was called home. The United States was changing rapidly. His father, John Adams, had become president, and the rivalry between political factions, Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans, was tearing the country apart. John Quincy returned not to rest, but to a new battlefield, American politics. He accepted a position in the U.S. Senate, believing he could serve honorably, even amidst division. But politics in Washington was a far cry from diplomacy in Europe. Here, battles were not fought with treaties, but with accusations, loyalties, and betrayals. Senators did not debate as philosophers. They fought as warriors, and the wounds were personal. John Quincy stood where truth led him, not where party leaders demanded he stand. This earned him enemies. He voted for measures he believed were necessary, even when they came from political opponents. He refused to support policies that benefited party loyalty rather than the nation. He was mocked, pressured, and eventually abandoned by his own party. But his mother's words echoed. You were not born for ease, but for purpose. He held his integrity like a torch in a storm. By 1808, he resigned from the Senate, not in defeat, but in preservation of principle. And then came a moment of vindication. President Thomas Jefferson appointed him U.S. Minister to Russia. Once again, his clarity, discipline, and unwavering moral center brought him to the forefront of national service. The world had become his classroom. War, revolution, diplomacy, love, loss, and political fire had shaped him. He was no longer the boy who watched candle flames flicker against the walls while his parents spoke of liberty. He was a man now, honed by oceans, kingdoms, and the shifting tides of nations. And ahead lay the greatest trials of his life. Trials that would shape him into the 6th President of the United States. The year was 1809 when John Quincy Adams stepped onto the frozen soil of St. Petersburg, Russia. He and his wife, Louisa Catherine Adams, had traveled across icy seas and bitter winds to reach this distant empire. An empire where winter did not merely chill the air, but seemed to seep into the very bones of the land. The sky stretched pale and endless above the Neva River, and the great palaces of the czars gleamed like frozen cathedrals of marble and light. Russia was unlike anything Adams had ever encountered. Europe had taught him diplomacy and intellect. America had taught him principle and endurance. But Russia demanded something else: patience. Here, power did not move quickly or openly. Decisions were whispered behind doors carved with gold. Authority was a silent presence, heavy as the snow that blanketed the city for half the year. John Quincy was appointed United States Minister to the Russian Empire, a prestigious yet challenging post. The United States sought recognition, trade, and goodwill in a world where old monarchies viewed the young republic with skepticism. Russia's ruler, Tsar Alexander I, was a man of contradictions, cultured yet cautious, idealistic yet unpredictable. Winning his respect required diplomacy that was both subtle and unrelenting. John Quincy approached this new stage with the calm discipline that had become the foundation of his character. Life at the imperial court. St. Petersburg was a city of grandeur, but its beauty carried the weight of silence. The glittering Winter Palace hosted elaborate balls where chandeliers sparkled like constellations overhead, and the noble elite danced in robes trimmed with silver and ermine. The music was soft, the steps graceful, but every gesture, every laugh, every bow was part of a performance. Louisa, with her fluent French and delicate charm, adapted to court life easily. She could glide across a ballroom floor like she had been born for it. She understood the art of conversation, how a single compliment could open a door otherwise locked. The Russian nobles adored her. They called her the American Rose in winter. John Quincy, however, saw the world differently. He had no interest in court gossip, lavish displays, or social triumph. He attended the balls, yes, but his presence was one of purpose, not participation. He observed rather than performed. He listened rather than embellished. He once wrote in his journal, "In matters of government, spectacle is often the mask of power, but rarely its substance." This clarity allowed him to navigate the Russian court with remarkable precision. While others lost themselves in luxury, John Quincy focused on relationships, information, and diplomatic opportunities. He sought alliances that were quiet, steady, and lasting. Tsar Alexander I took notice. They met often, not in the crowded halls of celebration, but in private rooms where discussions flowed as steadily as the river outside. The Tsar was drawn to Adams' directness. Most diplomats flattered. Adams did not. Most sought favor. Adams sought understanding. The Tsar respected him because he spoke not as a supplicant, but as a man who believed deeply in the cause he represented. Yet beneath the silvered beauty of St. Petersburg, life was harsh. The winter stretched for months, relentless and unyielding. Snow piled as high as windowsills. The sun climbed low in the sky and disappeared early. Carriages slid over frozen streets while the wind howled like a living creature. Louisa, despite her grace, suffered deeply in this cold world. Illness visited her often, and loneliness gnawed at her when John Quincy was consumed by diplomatic tasks. She miscarried their daughter in Russia, a grief that left her feeling like a ghost in her own home. John Quincy felt this loss sharply, but he did not speak of it publicly. His love was deep, but his grief was private, hidden behind steady eyes and disciplined posture. He supported Louisa in quiet ways, reading to her, writing letters when he traveled, and sitting beside her on long evenings when the silence was heavier than the snow pressing against the windows. They had come to Russia together, but they endured Russia alone, side by side. War comes to Europe. As John Quincy worked in St. Petersburg, the world beyond the palace walls shifted violently. The Napoleonic Wars ravaged Europe. France's armies marched through kingdoms like wildfire. Alliances broke as quickly as they were formed. The delicate balance of power crumbled. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, the world held its breath. The French army of hundreds of thousands marched into the vast Russian frontier. And the Russians burned everything before them, fields, homes, entire towns, to deny Napoleon supplies. Winter did what armies could not. The French soldiers froze, starved, and died in snow deeper than their cannons. John Quincy witnessed the ripple of this catastrophe from St. Petersburg. He wrote, "This land is enormous. It is not conquered by fire or sword. It devours invaders with silence and ice." The war weakened Europe but strengthened the United States' position on the diplomatic stage. America was no longer simply a young nation. Now, it was a stable observer in a collapsing world. Tsar Alexander saw that John Quincy Adams represented not merely a country, but a principle, a belief that government could be rooted not in empire, but in the rights of the people. This made him valuable. The call to Ghent. In 1814, a message arrived that changed everything. The United States and Great Britain were at war, the War of 1812. Washington, D.C. had been burned. The nation's spirit was strained. Negotiations were needed to end the conflict, and the American government chose one man to lead the treaty delegation: John Quincy Adams. His time in Russia ended not in failure or scandal, but in triumph. Selected for one of the most critical diplomatic missions in American history. He packed his journals, letters, books, and the few personal belongings that meant anything to him. Louisa prepared to travel again, her heart heavy but steady. They left St. Petersburg by sleigh, crossing frozen rivers, windswept plains, and snow-laden forests. Their journey took 6 weeks through winter's heart before reaching the port. They sailed to Ghent, Belgium, where British and American delegates gathered to negotiate an end to war. It was there, in candlelit rooms lined with maps of the world, that John Quincy Adams showed the full force of his mind. He refused to surrender 1 square mile of American territory. He rejected every proposal that hinted the U.S. must submit.
He argued with clarity so direct that even his opponents respected him. And in December 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. America had survived. Its sovereignty was recognized, its future secured. When John Quincy Adams left Russia, he was no longer a diplomat forged in the shadow of others. He had become a statesman, equal to the great figures of his age, shaped by winter, war, loss, love, and unshakable principle. Ahead of him waited the next great chapter, Secretary of State and the long road to the presidency. Life in Europe was not a grand parade of powdered wigs and endless banquets, the way stories sometimes make it sound. For John Quincy Adams, it was quieter, more internal, like a long hallway of rooms he kept opening inside his own mind. He was surrounded by diplomats twice his age, men who negotiated borders the way merchants negotiated sacks of grain. He listened before he spoke. He observed before he acted. He realized early that the most powerful person in the room was often the one who spoke the least. His father, John Adams, now an ambassador himself, was stern but not unkind. He believed his son could do great things, but he believed even more strongly that greatness required rigor. So when others slept, young Quincy was reading dispatches. When others enjoyed wine and laughter under candlelight, he was copying letters, revising arguments, practicing French pronunciation until his tongue ached. Yet it was not all seriousness. Europe in the late 18th century was full of strange contradictions. Opulence beside poverty, philosophy beside war, music beside misery. John Quincy adored walking through the streets of Paris in the early evening, where lanterns glowed like small suns, and strangers discussed ideas in cafes as if words themselves could change history. And perhaps they could. This was the age of revolutions, after all. America had just won its independence. France was rumbling beneath its own old structure, like a beast breathing before it wakes. He watched people. He watched the way a baker spoke to a noble, the way soldiers walked differently after victory than they did after loss. He watched how men believed they could shape the world simply by declaring it so. He felt both exhilarated and small. There were letters, many letters. Letters to his mother, Abigail, sharp and tender in equal measure. She reminded him to stay true to reason. She reminded him that public life devours those who enter it wrapped in vanity. She told him to stay humble, even if the world tried to dress him in borrowed crowns. John Quincy learned languages not as trophies, but as keys. French opened salons and embassies. Dutch unlocked trade and diplomacy. Latin and Greek reminded him that civilizations rise and fall like tides, but human ambition remains constant, restless as a bird pacing in a cage. Then came Russia. Catherine the Great wanted American recognition, and America wanted allies. So John Quincy was sent to St. Petersburg, where winter did not simply arrive, it ruled. Snow fell like endless sheets unfurled from the sky, covering roads, rivers, silence itself. The court shimmered with jewels and suspicion. Every smile had a shade of meaning behind it. John Quincy did not dazzle them with charm. He never tried. Instead, he carried himself with quiet clarity. He spoke carefully. He watched constantly. He became, in a way, like the winter around him. Still, sharp, patient. He wrote in his diary that diplomacy was not argument. It was endurance. It was the art of not being provoked. It was the ability to keep your own thoughts guarded while gently coaxing others to reveal theirs. In the evenings, when the palace fires glowed and the air hummed with cold, he would read poetry, Milton, Shakespeare, the ancient poets whose languages he had carved into muscle memory. Their words reminded him that beneath all politics, all ambition, all armor, there was still the human heart. And so chapter by chapter, winter by winter, John Quincy Adams was no longer simply the son of a founding father. He was becoming something else, someone shaped by continents, languages, revolutions, silence, and long corridors of candlelit negotiation. Someone the world would one day call a leader. When John Quincy Adams returned to America, the country he stepped into was not the same one he had left. It was younger still, raw and loud with the voices of people trying to define what freedom truly meant. The revolution was over, but in many ways the real building had only begun. Roads were rough, banks uncertain, tempers short. Everyone had ideas. Everyone believed their ideas were the ones that could save the nation. He was no longer the quiet boy studying beside diplomats in gilded halls. He had become a man with a mind carved by distance, by cold Russian winters and French debates that burned like fire. Yet America did not care about what Europe had shaped in him. America was a place where a man had to prove himself all over again. His father, now the second president of the United States, knew this better than anyone. Public service, John Adams told his son, is not a reward. It is a burden one chooses. Quincy understood. He did not expect applause. He first became a lawyer in Boston. The work was steady, but his heart belonged to the larger stage, where ideas shaped nations. His writings began appearing in newspapers. He criticized policies when they were weak. He defended principles when they were threatened. He wrote not to charm, but to challenge. And people noticed. Some admired him, some despised him. This, too, was a kind of progress. Soon he was appointed to the United States Senate. The room was smaller than the courts of Europe, but the stakes felt heavier. Every debate echoed with the weight of the Republic's future. The senators argued fiercely about money, about foreign alliances, about the limits of freedom itself. Quincy did not raise his voice often, but when he did, the room stilled. He spoke with a clarity that came from years of watching powerful men hide behind empty words. Yet politics in America was not the calm, steady world of diplomacy. It was messy, full of alliances that broke as quickly as they were formed. Quincy sometimes stood alone. He voted according to principle, not party, and that made him both respected and distrusted. Some called him stubborn, some called him incorruptible. Both were true. It was during this time that one of his greatest convictions took root, the belief that America must remain independent, truly independent, not tied to the ambitions of any empire. He had seen the old world. He knew the traps of glory, conquest, and pride. So when foreign powers tried to pull the young United States into their conflicts, Quincy argued fiercely against it. Let Europe fight its old battles. Let America build something new. But being principled in politics is like walking through a forest of thorns. Every step costs you something. Eventually, disagreements with his own party grew too sharp to ignore. He resigned from the Senate, not defeated, but unwilling to bend his convictions into shapes that no longer resembled truth. Some called it foolish. Some quietly admired the courage of it. After his resignation, something unexpected happened. President James Madison appointed him as minister to Russia, the very place that had taught him the art of endurance. And so, once again, Quincy boarded a ship across the Atlantic, carrying with him not just experience, but purpose. He was older now. The world no longer felt vast and overwhelming. It felt navigable, understandable, human. The young republic still needed guidance, and in his quiet, steady way, John Quincy Adams intended to give it.
The ship cut through gray waves, heading toward the north where winter seemed to live year-round. John Quincy Adams stood on deck, coat pulled tight, hair blown back by salt wind. He knew this journey well. Russia was not a foreign mystery to him anymore. It was a place of cold skies, endless forests, and palaces that shone like frozen fire. But this time, he was not a boy observing history from a corner. He was a man entrusted with shaping it. Russia greeted him with familiar silence. Snowfall muffled sound, as though the land itself discouraged careless words. St. Petersburg rose like a dream carved from ice, vast, majestic, intimidating. The Neva River lay frozen solid, and sleighs glided across it with bells chiming like glass. People bowed politely, but their eyes told stories of caution and calculation. It was a country where power moved quietly, behind doors no one admitted existed. Quincy was welcomed at court. Tsar Alexander I, tall and elegant, had bright, restless eyes always thinking, always weighing. He greeted Quincy not as a stranger, but as a mind he recognized. Diplomats remembered those who spoke with clarity instead of flattery. "You returned to Russia a different man," the Tsar said during their first private meeting. Quincy smiled. "And Russia greets me with the same winter I remember." Alexander laughed softly. "Winter does not change, men do." Their conversations rarely stayed on formal matters. They debated philosophy, the responsibilities of rulers, the fragility of nations. Quincy understood something deeply. Diplomacy was not merely negotiation. It was the slow weaving of trust. But while Russia seemed still, the world was not. Europe was on fire. Napoleon marched like a storm across the continent. His armies reshaped kingdoms and crushed dynasties. Kings feared him. Soldiers worshipped him. The map of Europe twisted and shrank under his shadow. And America, across the ocean, watched. The young republic tried to remain neutral, but neutrality is a fragile thing when the world is burning. One evening, as Quincy studied letters from home, he saw it. War had broken out. The United States and Britain were locked in conflict once again. The War of 1812. Trade routes collapsed, communication faltered, American ships were seized at sea, and John Quincy Adams was far away, sitting in gilded halls while his country bled. He felt torn. Diplomats know how to stand still while the world around them runs. But Quincy was not built to be still. He cared too deeply. He believed too strongly in the survival of the Republic. Then came a message from Washington. He was to join a delegation to negotiate peace with Britain. The location, Ghent, in present-day Belgium. The mission, bring an end to the war. The stakes, the very identity of the United States. He prepared to leave Russia, and the Tsar called for him one last time. "You believe a nation can be reasonable," Alexander said. "That is rare." Quincy answered, "A nation must try to be reasonable, or it becomes merely powerful." The Tsar's expression softened as though he recognized something noble and impossible. "Then go," he said. "The world needs men who still believe that." The journey to Ghent was long and difficult. Snowstorms swallowed roads, rivers froze, days bled into nights. But Quincy traveled with the patience of someone who has already crossed oceans of uncertainty.
His companions in the delegation were skilled, but they did not all share his clarity. Some wanted compromise. Some wanted victory written in bold letters. Quincy wanted something simpler and harder: dignity. Negotiations with the British began in earnest. The British diplomats were cool, confident, almost amused. To them, America was young, a nation throwing punches at a giant. They expected apology. They expected surrender. They expected weakness. Quincy gave them none of these things. He did not argue loudly. He used language the way a craftsman uses tools: precise, measured, unbroken. While others grew heated, Quincy remained calm. He remembered his father's words: "Shouting does not make your argument true." But diplomacy is not a duel fought only with logic. It is fought with endurance. Weeks stretched into months. Letters from home spoke of cities burned, ports blockaded, soldiers weary. Some Americans demanded more war. Some demanded peace at any cost. Quincy stood between those storms and refused to be moved by either. One cold December morning, after endless drafts, crossed-out clauses, and negotiations that spun in circles, the treaty was signed. The War of 1812 was over. There were no grand victories written in gold, no territories dramatically gained or lost, but something crucial happened. The United States remained whole. It remained independent. It remained itself. Sometimes peace itself is the triumph. When Quincy stepped outside into the winter air, snow fell in quiet flakes. The street was silent, no crowds cheered, no trumpets sounded. But he felt something inside him settle, the way a stone settles into place in a foundation. He had helped the nation standing. When he returned to America, he did not expect celebration. He did not receive it. Americans seldom celebrate peacemakers. They forget those who prevent disaster while praising those who survive it. But history remembers. And history would remember John Quincy Adams not merely as a diplomat, but as a guardian, one who protected the young republic's right to define its own future. He was ready for whatever came next, though he did not yet know that soon he would be asked to shape America not just from across seas, but from within the halls of power itself. When John Quincy Adams returned to the United States after the Treaty of Ghent, he found a nation transformed. The war had not been won, but it had been survived, and survival itself felt like a kind of victory. American pride had swelled. A new generation spoke with confidence, no longer seeing the United States as an experiment, but as a country with a future written clearly before it. John Quincy was appointed Secretary of State under President James Monroe. It was a role perfectly suited to his temperament. Diplomacy was not merely his profession, it was the language in which he thought. In that position, he helped shape treaties that stretched the boundaries of the young country farther west, negotiated the acquisition of Florida from Spain, and crafted the famous Monroe Doctrine, a declaration that would echo across hemispheres for centuries. It asserted simply, the Americas are not open to European domination. The world heard it. Some dismissed it, others feared it, but everyone understood that America had found its voice. Yet, for all this influence, John Quincy Adams did not feel powerful. He worked tirelessly, writing long into the night, answering letters with careful precision, scrutinizing every word he issued as though each sentence were history waiting to harden into stone. He was respected, he was admired, but he was not loved, and that bothered some people more than it bothered him. He had never sought to be loved, he had always sought to be right. Still, something began to shift in the public mind, a whisper. a suggestion, a possibility spoken with the casual confidence of people who assume the future will obey their expectations. John Quincy Adams might become the next president of the United States. He did not encourage this. He did not travel the country shaking hands. He did not flatter crowds or deliver speeches heavy with emotional appeal. He believed public office should find a man, not the other way around. But America was not the same republic his father had served. The idea of the self-made common man had entered the bloodstream of politics. War heroes were adored. Stories of rugged simplicity charmed voters more than elegant reasoning or studied experience. And standing in the center of this new age was Andrew Jackson. Jackson was a storm of a man, fiery, bold, magnetic. He had carved his fame out of battlefields and frontier myth. Where Quincy spoke with careful thought, Jackson spoke with raw force. People cheered his anger, his certainty, his unpolished honesty. He was a hero to many who felt unseen by the polished halls of ancestry and education.
The election of 1824 would not be an ordinary election. It would be a collision. 4 men ran for president, and none of them would win a clear majority. The campaign itself was a spectacle of rising tension. Newspapers became weapons sharper than swords. Accusations flew like sparks. Quincy, who detested public conflict, suddenly found himself a target. His education was mocked, his diplomacy was painted as weakness. Some whispered he was European in spirit, as though thoughtfulness was an un-American trait. He refused to strike back. He refused to speak low of any opponent. He refused to become what politics was becoming. Election day came and passed. Votes were counted, and the result was chaos. Andrew Jackson had won the most popular votes, and he had won the most electoral votes, but he had not won a majority. The Constitution sent the election to the House of Representatives. Whispers turned into storms. Rooms filled with quiet deals, promises were made in the dark. Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, disliked Jackson deeply. Clay believed Jackson's anger was too dangerous to be placed in the executive chair. He saw in Quincy something he understood: reasoning, restraint, the ability to govern without passion overpowering judgment. Clay threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. And in February of 1825, the House elected John Quincy Adams as the 6th President of the United States. There were no celebrations in the streets. There were no fireworks. There were no crowds cheering. Instead, there were accusations. Andrew Jackson's supporters roared betrayal. They claimed Quincy and Clay had struck a corrupt bargain. They claimed democracy had been cheated, the will of the people overturned. And though no proof existed, no evidence at all, the accusation stuck like tar. Quincy took the oath of office in a quiet ceremony on a cold March morning. His face calm, his posture straight, his expression grave, not victorious, but burdened. He stood before a divided nation, and he knew it. He did not begin his presidency with praise. He began it with suspicion. He did not receive trust. He received resentment. Yet even then, the weight of the moment did not break him. He had not sought power, but now that it had come to him, he would use it for the country's good, even if the country did not thank him. He wrote in his diary that night, his words steady. I would choose honor without power rather than power without honor. Yet Providence has given me both the power and the obligation to act. I shall not waste the gift, however fraught. His presidency would not be easy. It would not be joyous. It would not be celebrated in his lifetime. But it would be his duty.
and he would fulfill it with the same relentless, unwavering dedication that had guided him since childhood. He was now the leader of the nation his father had once guided. The son had returned to the seat of the father. But unlike his father, his journey here had not been a flame that rose brightly and faded quickly. It had been a slow, steady fire, built over decades of patience, thought, and endurance. John Quincy Adams, the reluctant candidate, was now President of the United States. The storm of politics swirled around him, but he would meet it with the only weapons he trusted: clarity, reason, and the quiet courage of a man who does not need applause to know his purpose. The presidency was not a throne, nor was it a stage. Yet from the moment John Quincy Adams stepped into the executive mansion, he felt the heat of a spotlight and the weight of chains. The house itself, unfinished, drafty, and sparsely furnished, seemed to echo with whispers of discontent. It did not greet him as home. It received him as a question. Was he truly the chosen leader of the American people, or had he taken a seat that belonged to someone else? He knew the accusations were false. No bargain had been struck. No promises had been exchanged. Yet perception often outweighs truth, and the perception of corruption poisoned the air he breathed. Newspapers printed drawings of him as a king in disguise. Political clubs called him a usurper. Andrew Jackson, burning with indignation, positioned himself not merely as an opponent, but as the voice of the people betrayed. And so from his first day in office, Quincy was a president at war without soldiers, a leader without the loyalty of those he served. Yet he did not bend. He believed the presidency existed for service, not popularity. He believed governing required thought, not applause. And so he set to work, not to defend his reputation, but to shape the future. He presented a vision bold and unprecedented: a national university, a network of canals, roads stretching across states, astronomical observatories, and a cultural investment in science and knowledge. He wanted America to grow not only in size, but in mind. He envisioned a country that did not merely expand its borders, but expanded its capacity to understand the world. But America was changing. The era of emotional politics had begun. Grand ideas of infrastructure and education did not stir hearts the way Jackson's direct, fiery appeals did. The people wanted simplicity. They wanted someone who spoke like them, lived like them, fought like them. Quincy's proposals were celebrated by intellectuals and mocked by the growing wave of populists. "What good are observatories?" they jeered. "Can the stars help a farmer till the soil?" His defenders argued he looked toward the future. His critics claimed he could not see the present. Still, he persisted. Each morning, he rose before dawn, walked the quiet corridors of the executive mansion, and began writing reports, speeches, letters, proposals. His pen rarely stopped. His resolve never wavered. Yet the Congress, dominated by Jackson supporters, blocked nearly every measure he introduced. He would propose a road, they would halt it. He would outline a scientific academy, they would laugh it out of session. The presidency became a daily reminder of how difficult leadership is when a nation is divided not by geography, but by belief. And yet, there were victories, not loud ones, but meaningful ones. He supported treaties that opened commerce. He defended Native American lands against hunger from expanding states, though few thanked him for it. He strengthened the role of the United States on the international stage, maintaining peace in a world that still swayed from the violence of war. But even these triumphs were overshadowed by politics. Andrew Jackson waded beyond the walls of the executive mansion like a storm on the horizon. He rallied crowds by speaking to their frustrations, their pride, their longing to be heard. People saw him as a man who belonged to them. Quincy, meanwhile, seemed to many like a man who belonged to history books rather than towns and farms. The election of 1828 arrived not as a civic process, but as a battlefield. It was the dirtiest presidential campaign the nation had ever seen. Insults printed in newspapers grew venomous. Quincy's morality, his family, even his religious devotion were attacked. Andrew Jackson and his supporters painted Quincy as elitist, cold, un-American. Quincy refused to descend into the mud. He did not insult. He did not accuse. He believed the office was sacred, and he would not stain it for the sake of winning. But America, at that moment in time, did not want restraint. It wanted fire. When the votes were counted, Andrew Jackson had won in a landslide. John Quincy Adams was still president, but only in name. He agreed to a peaceful transfer of power, though inside he felt the old echo of his father's heartbreak. 2 Adams presidents had come, and both had served only 1 term. On the night before leaving office, Quincy walked alone through the executive mansion. He passed portraits of Washington and Jefferson, their painted eyes calm and still. He paused in front of his father's portrait, the first Adams president. The oil paint seemed to flicker in the candlelight. He remembered being a boy in Europe, watching his father negotiate, watching him hope. He remembered how his father believed that service to one's country was the highest purpose a man could pursue. But service, Quincy learned, did not guarantee gratitude. The next morning, he left the Capitol without ceremony. No crowds gathered to say goodbye, no cheers, no applause, only the rattle of carriage wheels on cobblestones as the city receded behind him. Yet, he did not feel defeated. He felt unfinished. For while others saw the end of his political life, he saw another beginning just beyond the horizon. He did not yet know that fate would return him to Washington, not as president, but something rarer, a voice of conscience, a challenger of injustice, a man who would fight not for power, but for principle. John Quincy Adams had lost the presidency, but he had not yet completed his legacy. For sometimes, history grants its greatest purpose not at the height of power, but after power is taken away. When John Quincy Adams returned to his home in Massachusetts, he expected, perhaps for the first time in many years, a life of quiet routine. He imagined mornings spent walking among the apple trees, afternoons reading in his study where sunlight warmed the floorboards, and evenings with his family, free from the constant demands of politics. But the land had its own kind of silence, one that did not soothe. He tried to rest, but rest had never been his nature. He felt unfinished, as though a sentence had ended too soon. He had served his country across oceans, across wars, across shifting eras, but something in him still burned. Not ambition, not wounded pride, something deeper, a calling. It arrived unexpectedly. The people of the 12th Congressional District of Massachusetts asked him to represent them in the House of Representatives. No former president had ever done such a thing. Tradition said that once a man had sat in the executive chair, he stepped out of the public arena forever. The presidency was considered the summit, and descending from it seemed like stepping backwards down the mountain of history. But John Quincy Adams did not believe in summits. He believed in service. He accepted, And so, in 1831, the former president took a seat in Congress, not at the front of the chamber, not elevated above others, but simply and plainly among them. No applause rang through the hall. Many congressmen watched him with suspicion, some with amusement, but they underestimated him. For John Quincy Adams was no longer a diplomat bound by quiet negotiation. He was no longer a president constrained by the weight of public expectation. He was a free man, free to speak, free to challenge, free to fight. And he would choose his battlefield. Slavery. It was the darkest contradiction in America. The declaration that all men are created equal, written into a nation where millions were held as property. Many politicians avoided the subject entirely. Some justified slavery as tradition. Some believed the country would collapse if it were ever questioned. But John Quincy Adams had traveled the world. He had seen nations torn apart by injustice. He believed that a republic that preached liberty while practicing bondage was like a house built on sand. And so he spoke. He spoke in a voice that was not loud, but steady, so steady that silence bent toward it. At first, his speeches were met with restless shuffling, irritated glances, whispers of, "Here he goes again." Slaveholders tightened their jaws. They called him a fanatic. They called him a traitor to his region, to the comfort of compromise. But Quincy did not speak for their comfort. He spoke for the enslaved who had no seat in the chamber. He soon earned a name, not one he chose, but one that fit him well. The Old Man Eloquent. His hair had gone white, his shoulders curved slightly with age, but his words had lost none of their sharpness. He could slice through arguments with a single sentence, lift the floor of debate with a phrase that felt like history speaking. And the fight grew fierce. Pro-slavery legislators pushed through the gag rule, a rule banning any discussion of slavery in Congress. The aim was clear: silence him. John Quincy Adams stood. "No rule," he declared, "shall silence the voice of conscience." He challenged the gag rule day after day. When gavel after gavel fell against him, he raised his voice again. They tried to censure him. They tried to shame him. They tried to remove him. But he had long ago grown immune to public scorn. His endurance became legendary. Some nights he returned to his rooms so exhausted that he could barely remove his coat. His handwriting, once precise, now trembled from strain. His doctor warned him that the stress was wearing away his life. Still, he returned to the chamber each morning, walking slowly, leaning on his cane, but with eyes bright and burning. He fought not because he believed he would see slavery end in his lifetime, but because he believed the nation had to begin facing itself.
Adams stood at the wide window of his home in Quincy, Massachusetts, watching early winter settle across the fields like a soft, pale blanket. Snowflakes drifted in slow spirals, landing on the bare branches of apple trees he had planted decades earlier. The world felt quieter now, slowed but not yet finished. Age had taken weight from his shoulders but added to his thoughts. He was no longer a young diplomat crossing European courts, nor a president navigating storms of politics. He was simply John Quincy Adams, husband, father, thinker, stubborn idealist. Visitors still came sometimes. Scholars, young politicians, curious travelers, anyone who admired his fierce devotion to principle. They came to ask him about diplomacy, about leadership, about the new America growing around them. But Adams rarely talked about government first. Instead, he talked about people, about character, about the importance of thinking slowly, acting deliberately, and refusing to surrender to convenience when truth was at stake. Louisa sat nearby, reading by the fire. They no longer needed many words between them.
Their years had been full of seas crossed, courts endured, children lost, victories won. Love no longer needed to prove itself. It simply rested there, like warmth shared between two hands in winter. Sometimes his thoughts returned to Washington, not the marble and columns, but the House floor where he had made his final stand. He could still feel the rush in his chest when he rose to speak for freedom, his voice trembling not from age, but from conviction. He remembered the moment he collapsed, the room spinning, colleagues rushing to him. There was no fear in that moment, only a quiet certainty that he had spoken the words he needed to speak. His final days were not filled with regret, but they were layered with reflection. A life, after all, is not made of positions held or titles earned. It is made of the moments when one refuses to betray one's own soul. On one cold morning, he took a slow walk among the apple trees. The snow had begun to melt, leaving patches of dark earth beneath. He placed one hand on the rough bark of the oldest tree. He remembered planting it with his sons, small hands helping his larger ones steady the root ball. Growth took time. Shape came slowly. The world changed in seasons, not in speeches. As he walked back toward the house, a thin breeze carried the distant sound of church bells. He smiled, not with triumph, not with sorrow, but with something softer, acceptance. His legacy would never be simple. Some would call him stern. Others would call him brilliant. Some would misunderstand him entirely. That too was human. What mattered most was the truth he had tried to protect. That freedom must be continually defended, not only on fields of battle, but in everyday conscience. That knowledge is not luxury, it is responsibility. And that a nation's greatness depends not on ambition, but on character. When John Quincy Adams finally passed, the winter light was gentle, snow resting like peace across the fields. Louisa held his hand. His face was serene, as if he were listening to something distant and familiar. And so ended the life of a man who spent his days in service, not only to a country, but to principle itself. Yet his ideas did not die with him. They lingered, like echoes across history, like seeds waiting for a new spring.
If you liked this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more great stories.